I'm going to share a little bit of information. It's going to be a short video compared to some of my others. But just to let you guys know that are listening, in about 3 to 4 months, there will be a book coming out that I'm working on. I've been working on it for quite some time now. And it'll be titled Culture Shockwaves in Black and Not Just White. And some of this information that I'm going to share today and some of that you've seen on some of my other videos will be explained in a lot more depth and detail. One of the ways that our black identity and energy has been misleading and misdirecting was the use of the term African American. And it was actually during the Civil Rights Movement era that the word Negro was deemed offensive. Negro was actually derived from the word Niger, which is actually a Latin term for the word black. And it was primarily used by Portuguese and Spaniards to describe people that had dark skin. And from the time the blacks hit the shores of the 13 colonies, they were referred to as colored and Negro. Now they had some other identities before that. They called them Ebos, Igbos, and some other things, Hebrew. But until the 1950s, the words colored and Negro were actually interchangeable. And the word Afro-American was first used in 1892 as the name of a black newspaper, since blacks were said to be of African descent. And sure, the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade were picked up off the shores of Western Africa, but a lot of times history has left out a lot of information because those people that were picked up off the west coast of Africa in the beginning were not African. They were actually Hebrews that had run down first to Egypt when the Romans invaded in 70 AD. And from Egypt, they moved over to the west coast of Africa. And I know a lot of people are saying, Africans didn't sell anybody into slavery or exchange goods for other tribesmen in slavery. Well, yes, they did. And first and foremost, the first people they were selling were actually black Hebrews. They weren't black Africans. And there's some information out there. There are several ambassadors over in Africa, several kings over in Africa who've actually apologized for the role that their ancestors played in slavery. So I don't understand why all of these people want to sit here and say blacks had nothing to do with slavery. It just doesn't fit. Now, to show you that it was not Hebrews, and it's going to be included in the book as well, that they were being sold, we have people from that time, historical accounts, that said once they ran out of Hebrews, they started selling Africans because the profit was so good. Now, if they had been selling Africans beforehand, why did they start to sell Africans after millions had already been taken away? But we're going to move on with this topic of this title of African American. And the word African American was first used in 1899. It never caught on though. And we have to wonder why these blacks during slavery and right out of slavery were never called Afro or African American. They were called Negro, nigger, black, or colored. They were never called Afro or African. They always said they were taken from the shores of Africa. The further blacks moved away from slavery, they've been trying to identify with a continent because the identity was stripped from them. Malcolm X, once he left the Nation of Islam, and many of those in the civil rights movement or establishment considered the words Negro, colored, and black to be offensive. In the place of these words, Afro-American took footing again around the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 1960s. And in the 1970s, African American slowly started to creep back in as well as our official designation. In the early 80s, it started to become used a lot more. And a guy named Johnny Duncan had heard somebody talking about American, and the last 4 letters in American was I can. And so he wrote a poem titled I Can, and Johnny Duncan's a black guy. And because he said if you took African and American, and the last 4 letters in each one of those was I can. So he wrote a poem titled I Can in 1987, which will be included in all black calendars up until the year 1993. But in 1989, Jesse Jackson caught a copy of it that Johnny Duncan had sent to Coretta Scott King, and he then collaborated with a young lady named Ramona Edlin and others, and they actually made the push to use the term African American. And there was a bill and a big push. You can search that information up as well, but it'll be included in the book as well, about Jesse Jackson and these folks going and making a push for the official designation. Now, there are a lot of people out there who claim that the word African American was used long before. I'm not going to argue with that about use. Use and acceptance are two different things. How many of you born before 1980 remember the term African American being used more than black or Negro? Calling the majority of black descendants Africans in America further pushed the identification further down the road. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Jesse Jackson, and that entire civil rights establishment passed along faulty information by telling blacks in America that they were African. Think about something else. Carter G. Woodson started Negro History Week, not African American History Week. Even today, it's called Black History Month, not African American History Month. If the term black was so offensive in the past, why do we call it Black History Month today, not African American History Month? If the term Negro History Week was offensive, why did Carter G. Woodson name it that? You know, Carter G. Woodson and Booker T. Washington and Garvey and all these guys, everything that they did had Negro in it. Everything that they created had the word Negro in it. You think by Carter G. Woodson calling it Negro History Week, since he was actually close to the institution of slavery, that blacks were not he knew blacks were not African? In every one of Carter G. Woodson's books, and he has several, and just to throw this in there, I have a video on my channel called Free Blacks Who Own Slaves, where I get a lot of hate on it. And that's okay. I don't have time to argue back and forth with people who haven't studied this stuff. And a lot of the information in that book came out of one of Carter G. Woodson's book, a man that blacks supposed to honor and revere. But they want to call me all kind of names. But back to my topic. Booker T. Washington started the National Negro Business League. He did not start the National African American Business League. Marcus Garvey started the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He didn't start the Universal African American Improvement Association. All of these men were close to the institution of slavery. And seeing what had transpired in our history, one would think that of all the people, these men would want to claim their African roots, if that's who they were. Blacks in America are the only people who don't identify with a country heritage. Our names have been changed based on who's doing the calling. When our ancestors came here, they changed the Hebrew recognition before the ships arrived to the shores of the 13 colonies in what would later become America. They were called colored, Negro, nigger, Afro-American, and finally our current identification of African Americans. The sad thing is we have been named after a continent we didn't even originate from. That continues to keep us as people in darkness. We are walking around with a made-up name. We have been named after a continent that we don't even belong to. Think about the other cultures around the world. They are recognized by the country they came from, not the continent. When was the last time you heard anyone call a Kenyan, an Ethiopian, Egyptian, or Somali an African? We do not call Indians, Chinese, Iranians, Japanese, or Filipinos Asians. We don't refer to those Albanians, Croatians, the French, or Irish as Europeans. Russia actually consists of two continents, but the people are referred to as Russians, not Europeans or Asians. The Bering Strait is actually part of North America, but it's a Russian property. Are the few inhabitants on the Bering Strait identifying themselves as North Americans? In all instances, they call themselves Russians. Even if we travel to the island countries around the world, we call them by their names. We call the blacks down in Jamaica Bahamians. We call the people in Trinidad Trinidadians. And we call the blacks in Jamaica Jamaicans. We call them the name that identifies with their country. When President Obama went to his roots, he went to Kenyan Ireland, not African Europe.